All right. What I want to talk to you about this evening, for me, is a little bit about the prospects and pitfalls of data capture. So this is a lecture that I gave recently to some of our research associates here at the University of Chicago. And it's a lecture that really exemplifies some of the features of the PRIB program and how it actually combines with some prior work that we have done here at the University of Chicago. And so what I'm going to share with you is a little bit about the work that I do. I'm going to give you a sense of the kinds of work that we will be touching on in that program. And yeah, I think some of you will have actually, I'm seeing some folks who joined us again. Some of this will intersect with work that I've talked about before, and it'll give you a sense of a little bit of what I do and what you'll get out of the program. So my work is at the intersection of political economy and development economics. More recently, I've been working on questions related to operations research. A lot of the work that I do is personally focused on organized violence, and that is thinking about both how individuals get mobilized to the use of violence, the strategies around violence, as well as thinking about technological innovation. How do warfighters innovate in the battle space? Some of the other work that I do, which is a much bigger picture, and I think might be of interest to some of you all, is to think about how we can use the role of information to shape individuals and their participation. So I have work in this domain specifically focused on how we can use targeted messaging to encourage individuals to reveal information about the location of roadside bombs. I also have a little bit of work on the role of information in shaping public support for insurgents. And I also have work that's focused on messaging. And a lot of this, like what you will notice in what we're about to talk about, is that a lot of it leverages a combination of big data as well as innovative research designs. And this is at the core of what we teach here at the University of Chicago, what I teach in my various courses, and as well as what you all will have an opportunity to learn about during the course of the summer. And so what I want to share with you all is a little bit of the insights into the mechanics of how that research is done. I want to talk about opportunities for data capture. I'm going to explain some of the sort of technical challenges that we face. And since I know some of you all have been in the audience before, hopefully now I'll have an opportunity to talk about some topics that I want to work on when I'm done. And in fact, I'll probably skip around a little bit to make sure that we get to talk about those things for those who've seen a little bit about this research before. And so I want to take a second to clarify, like, what exactly is data capture? Data capture is this idea that I can go out into the world and I can measure some quantities of interest. So I might want to measure things like unemployment or protests or armed opposition. And data capture is really about how do I go out and execute on that? How do we actually acquire signals about those features of the world around us? How do we go out and get the zeros and ones that will enable us to think about these problems in a quantitative way? And so that's part of it. The other part is, like, once I actually have those signals, I've thought about a clever way to go out and observe them. I have to think about, like, how exactly do I extract that data? How do I process that information to make it useful? And so, not every project is going to innovate on all of these dimensions. In fact, like, sometimes resolving question number 2 is in and of itself a challenge. How do we think about extracting and processing signals? And so what I can share is that I have done quite a bit of work in related spaces. And sometimes just going out and thinking about how do we build out the compute capacity to think about a hard problem, like that in and of itself is rather monumental. Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've done in the Afghan case to study insurgency. And so this work is largely made possible by access to data that was gathered by various coalition forces during the Afghan war. Combat is notoriously difficult to track in a systematic way. Most studies that you will go off and read about, so if you were to go and look on Google Scholar and try and identify research projects and papers about Afghanistan, many of those projects and papers will rely on media reports. Now, of course, if we were to rely on these media reports, that data itself will contain both known and unknown biases, and certainly none of that work is free of bias. Now, in some sense, Afghanistan was actually an empiricist insurgency, right? So it was a setting where a tremendous amount of data was being gathered, and if only we had access to that information, we might actually be able to study really dynamic questions. Well, fortunately, coalition forces actually collected that data. It was often events were logged and deduplicated, and they were updated with precise timestamps, often based on satellite device-enabled coordinates. Okay, and so that particular data set was information that myself and some colleagues were able to gain access to a number of years ago. In fact, almost a decade ago, and that included information about things like rebel-led surveillance networks, about rebel, training camp facilities, information about civilians collaborating with the government to provide information about roadside bombs, the location of illegal checkpoints, measures of battlefield innovation, as well as attack sophistication. So the types of things that were included in this data were absolutely mind-blowing. And of course, in that sense, the hard part was step number one. The hard part was actually going out and compiling that data. And in some sense, the hard work was actually done by the coalition forces who were building it. And so what we had to do is wait on a freedom of information request, and actually build out the institutional knowledge and the partnerships to understand the various features of that data set. And so here's a bit of a snapshot about that data. And so, on the left side of your screen, what you're seeing is combat operations in Lashkar Gah, which is in Helmand province. And what you're seeing here, right, is red dots. Every single one of these red dots represents a combat event that occurred in this location. And like the thing that you should be seeing in the shape that I'm showing you is it looks awfully like there's a regularized pattern to this. There's almost a structure to the points. And in fact, the structure is the road network of this community. That was how intense the combat operations were in this particular place. Now, on the right side of your screen, what you're seeing is something that's called a polar histogram. So a polar histogram tells us about the intensity of activity throughout a 24-hour cycle. And for each of the minutes in the 24-hour clock, we actually observed throughout the course of the war the ratio of combat operations. And again, like the thing that's behind this is hundreds of thousands of rows of data, all capturing the exact moment when events occur. And all of this is exactly the kind of data that we will be exploring throughout the program. Now, this is like one feature, is how do we go out and think about gaining access to a database that will unlock insights about a conflict, that will leverage the tremendous investment that others have made in the context. Another part of thinking about how do we go out and capture data is thinking about how do we innovate on the measurement side. And so this is a project that folks who have worked and gone through the various credential programs that we have here at the University of Chicago were actually instrumental on. One of our head TAs is an individual who actually worked on this project with me as a student years ago. And they, along with their colleagues who went through the credential program, were actually instrumental in supporting this particular project. And so this is an idea that I had many moons ago, late in my office. And I had this insight, which is that often like the nature of being able to observe data tells us something about a set of actors who are in control of the place that we would like to see into. Right. And so when we're thinking about a context of an ongoing contest, right, between insurgents or armed actors, often the ability to go in and gather high quality data is going to give us a useful insight into who has control of this place. And so I had this core idea, students who went through the credential program, as well as students who are currently full-time here at Harris, they helped me go through this process of thinking through the various wrinkles. And the crucial part is what came out of the end of this is that when I shared the idea of the project, which is on the screen now, basically that you can have places that actors can access and gather data, and that data can be of higher or low quality, that's going to tell us about places where we can go gather information. But it skips over the fact that there are places that we cannot see into. And the fact that we can't see into them is actually an indication that something is missing. And so in this particular context, I'm thinking about this in a setting where there's a government that would like to be able to go and gather data. There's an armed actor. It could be a criminal group, could be a political organization. It could be a warlord that would like the government from being able to see into that area. And what we're about to find out is who has control, because the ability to see into that population tells us about the capacity of one actor to stop another from seeing into the periphery. Now, the students years ago helped me think through this problem, and what came out of the other side was an opportunity to collaborate with NATO and some other actors to gain access to the raw data so that in Afghanistan, we could actually see into the periphery. We could understand the limits of what the government was able to observe. And what comes out of that is a set of projects where we're thinking about leveraging this incredible new data source to actually understand shifts in political authority. And what we find is that with the change in authority, there is this meaningful change in the ability of the government to engage in essential state functions like cracking down on narcotics. Another thing that we actually see in the data, which is rather tremendous, is that we can actually observe what happens to economic growth under competing governments. And this, in some sense, is a fundamentally novel question that no one has been able to study before, that innovative data capture allows us to put a lens on. And what we find is that in settings where there's a shift in authority, there's a significant decline in the local economy. And as it turns out, that decline in the local economy is driven by who has control over infrastructure. It turns out that it's uniquely bad if the Taliban has control in this particular setting, both of the distribution of electricity as well as the local community that you happen to reside in. So there's both an economic effect and an infrastructure effect. And to be clear, there's no judgment here, right? This is a setting where we have competing political actors. One actor happens to be better at providing a public service than another. And what we're seeing here is the very real consequence of this disparity in terms of the capacity of one actor versus another. Okay. Now, that's like one setting. Now I'm going to zoom you across the planet to another place that I happen to care quite a bit about, which is the United States. And this is a setting where there's a tremendous amount of both protest as well as acts of extremism here in the United States in the past half decade. Now, the tricky part about being able to observe and detect protest activity is that often approaches are going to leverage survey data. They're going to ask people whether or not they showed up at a protest. They will ask whether or not they participated. And of course, I think if we kind of opened up the room and I were to put to you the question, have you ever participated in a survey? Probably say yes. And I might ask you, if you were ever to reveal something like sensitive information, might you think twice about revealing the truth of what you're about to say based off of the potential repercussions? And you can imagine in a setting like this, where we want to study protests, we often want to study the protests in contexts that are sensitive. And if we were to ask direct questions about that, we might unfortunately get partial truths, half-truths, or an incomplete or unrepresentative measure of reality. And that's because there are well-known settings that will lead to bias. Okay. And so what we worked on throughout the 2020 and eventually 2021 is how exactly to think about measuring protests. And so we're able to do this by leveraging information about population movement. So we could do this in the United States. How many, now I'm curious actually, how many, and now I'm going to open up the chat because I would actually like to see people's responses. How many of you are able to, how many of you have a smartphone? Just curious. Post it up in the chat if you have a smartphone. Yeah. And do share if you have an iPhone or Android. Okay, interesting, interesting. Lots of iPhones, lots of got any Androids in the house tonight? Now I'm curious. Okay. All right. So what I would say is probably at least half of you, right, if not more, have a smartphone. And as it turns out, like the smartphone that you might be calling in from now, or the iPad that you're calling in from, or in fact the computer that you're using right now, it's probably connected to a Wi-Fi network, or it's connected to a cellular network transferring data packets. Um, and if it's a smart device, it almost certainly has a GPS transponder. And that GPS transponder will, on occasion, depending on an app that you probably have downloaded on your phone, it will leave breadcrumbs. It will leave a digital trace of the places that you have been throughout your day. And that data, right, that is at a global scale, trillions of observations per day feeding upward into a data set. I happen through various connections to have access to much of this data. And on particular days, some things will occur. And so in the United States, I got particularly curious about this for both personal and political reasons to understand a bit about the context of the George Floyd protests. And we developed a toolkit that would allow us to identify the locations of protest events. One could use that not only to study things like protests in favor of racial equality, but you can also imagine this to identify locations of protests like the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th. So there are these major events that we would like to be able to study, and this is a mechanism that will enable us to do this. And so the map that's on your screen right now is effectively a spatial distribution map of all of the origins of every device that showed up at the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. Now, one part of your brain is probably thinking, my, oh my, right? What have we done in the sharing of this kind of location information? And, one way of thinking about this is there are natural concerns about the limitations and the ethics of working with data of this type. And especially when we're thinking about topics like what I just discussed. But another setting that we could use similar data is to think about settings where we might actually use that information to enhance the effectiveness of public policy, not just as a way of thinking about the past and cataloging historical events, but thinking about the future. How can we, for example, leverage public messaging to enhance the effectiveness of public policy, especially in a conflict zone? And so we happen to study this in the setting of Ukraine, where what we wanted to do is we wanted to leverage the availability of big data to understand how the government's messaging platform actually impacts the shelter-seeking behavior of civilians. And what do we find is that overall there are really large effects. So when the government messages the public is very responsive overall. From their responsiveness, we can actually back out estimates of the number of lives that are potentially saved by those government programs, saving somewhere on the order between 35 to 45% of potential lives that could have been lost with the introduction of this program. But another thing that I would encourage you to think about, which is a part of the programs that we develop here, is not just to think about the first question, it's to think about the second and the third and the fourth question from any one of these interventions. And what the next question that we decided to explore is whether or not there were changes in the effectiveness of these programs over time. And indeed, that's exactly what we found. What we found is that those government programs, they worked overall, but the messages were most effective during the early phases of the conflict. This is in Ukraine. And that eventually declined over time, right? Now, of course, this is like one setting where we might want to study this. We might also want to think about population movement in other places. And so we were approached last year by the United Nations to do a project in Afghanistan to understand how changes in political authority shape displacement patterns. We used the same data that I've been describing thus far. And the goal here was to think about how might the World Bank and the United Nations and all of these humanitarian organizations, how they might better target assistance in real time. How could we leverage the skills that you'll have an opportunity to learn about this summer? How can we leverage them for good? How can we leverage them to improve welfare in a dynamic setting? And what we have in this context is the ability to do exactly that, to understand those displacement trends, to think about shifts over time so that we can identify where those populations are going and how we might actually better deliver that aid. And so on the left side of your screen are some of those trends. What we see is a large amount of displacement from points of origin throughout 2021, especially after local shifts in political authority. What you're seeing on the right side of your screen is ways that you can actually use these like incredibly advanced technological sensors to make better policy. And I think that at the end of the day, this is something that I hope that you will take away from your time with the University of Chicago, is that our goal is not simply to run regressions for the point of running regressions. Our goal is not just to think about stacking knowledge on knowledge just so that we can live the life of the mind. Our goal is to think about how we can recast the world around us to enhance human welfare and how we can use data for that purpose. And so the right side of the screen that you're seeing right now is exactly how we might do that in an unfolding setting where people are fleeing for their lives. And we need to think about what are the areas of targeting where we should deploy aid. And so what this suggests is that we should be targeting areas that have high population density, with significant market access, with trends in economic activity, that have infrastructure to support the population, that have access to electricity, where individuals might gain access to food. And on the downside of this is thinking about how we can actually use that information to better understand places where there might be gaps, places where individuals might not actually be going. In fact, they might be relocating away from these places. So for example, agriculturally intensive parts of the economy is one of them, areas with extreme ruggedness. All of these are locations where the World Bank and the United Nations, following this report, actually shifted their programs. And of course, one thing that I want to emphasize here is that the goal, again, is not just to train people who know how to think about regressions. Our goal is to think about how can we train people who will be stewards of the planet and stewards of their fellow humans. And that thing that I just showed you has made its way into the formation of public policy through the United Nations, and was enabled by support from students just like you, who came to work with the University of Chicago during the summer, who gave feedback on early versions of this project, who gave feedback on the core intuition, which we then went out and were able to implement in nearly real time to support policymaking in an at-risk setting. Now, I do want to take some time to highlight the fact that, as interesting or exciting as some of these projects might be, inevitably there will be pitfalls. And these are things that I want you to take seriously as you go into the summer program, as you are thinking about the choices that you're going to make, whether you're thinking about a choice for where you're going to go to undergraduate program, what program you're going to pursue in undergraduate studies, the last sort of sprint towards graduation, or if you're thinking about graduate studies, how you should be targeting those opportunities. And that's because at the end of the day, I hope that you take away from your experiences with the University of Chicago that we should both think about the promise and potential of working with big data, but to also understand and have in our minds the pitfalls at the core of when we might fail. And so things like sensors will break down. Data collectors will not always put in lots of effort. The subjects that are in our surveys might dynamically respond. And now that you've actually been on this evening course, you probably know to think twice about leaving your location permissions on whenever you're working with apps, right? And so notice what's happening here is that you're dynamically responding. And of course, that means that our inputs are going to change over time. And you need to be careful about that. The extraction process itself can introduce errors. It's going to constrain workflow. And at this point, our biggest constraint in terms of doing interesting and exciting work is actually not the data. It's our compute resources. It's our ability to gain access to and leverage cloud-based supercomputers that will enable us to do the work that we are most excited to do, right? And what I also want to emphasize here is that ethical challenges are everywhere. right? And you will often, if you work in this space, be the first person to think about working with a new sensor, or the first person to explore a use case with an existing platform. And of course, it is often easy to ignore or sidestep the sort of ethical elephant in the room, which is that just because you can does not mean that you should, right? And this is a question that I often grapple with myself, is that, I have thought seriously about several of the projects that I have started. And in the process of doing them, I have shelved these projects. I have put them to the side because I eventually became rather concerned about how the technology I was working with or developing could potentially be misappropriated. And at some point, you too, when you begin working on the frontier, will face these questions as well. Okay. And so things like privacy are genuinely a concern. And I know that at least one of you had a nice question in the chat about where we gain access to some of this data. Much of the data that I've shared with you this evening is not open source, right? Much of this data is proprietary or was previously classified. And so working with partners means constraining the set of questions that you can explore. It also means a reliance on data that might not necessarily have the level of informed consent that we would need, right? And that necessarily means that there are limitations in terms of what can be shared in a public domain, which I think it was June's question, means that there are limitations in terms of open science for the work that we are doing. Okay. I think that we all have different motivations for the research that we do. I'm mindful of time. And I just want to share real quick, like, that the work that I do, I genuinely hope makes the world a safer place. I have 3 wonderful children. I don't know if you've had a chance to to take a look at my website. They are certainly the best thing on my website. I've got pictures of my kids. I hope that this work, right, this work that helps us think about how to build peace in settings that are in conflict, how to think about understanding the consequences of instability, how to save lives during the course of ongoing conflicts, how to think about understanding what motivates people to engage in acts of political extremism. I hope that in the process of studying these things and helping to craft better public policy, I make the world a safer place for my children. And you probably have a similar motivation yourself. You have probably thought about ways that you want to leverage data and the skills that you need to actually analyze that resource to build an evidence base. You have probably thought about the fact that you too are motivated about ways to improve human welfare. But of course, once you produce and you disseminate that knowledge that you're going to build, it's often difficult for you to put it back inside of a bottle, right? And it's difficult to constrain how it might be used. And that's because once it is in the public domain, even actors acting in bad faith can leverage it. And I think this is something that, maybe we can talk a little bit about in the Q&A, but it is certainly something that I have thought deeply about, which is this question of, like, if I don't do it, then someone else will. And as you get better and better at the work, right, as you go through the summer program and you begin thinking about, like, your various insights about the world around you, you're going to substitute this, like, if I don't, someone else will. You're going to substitute it as in, if I don't, someone else will, and they are going to do it wrong or worse or less efficiently or less effectively than I would. And I'm better than that. And that is something that is easy to fall back into, and I would caution you against it. And I think that the thing that I would encourage you to think carefully about is not just how you can leverage a new data source, but whether or not you should. Okay, and I promised that I would make it through, and I appreciate Jessica and Young for suffering my sort of long-winded rant right now. But I do want to share one thing that I haven't had a chance to share before in this setting, which is to think about, like, what's next? Like, what are these sort of big questions that I think people who are interested in these kinds of topics might want to work on, right? And so, some things that I've been working on is, for example, a project called Risky Business, which is thinking about how firms sort of dynamically respond during conflicts to shifts in political authority. It is often the case that firms will act and work with both the government and non-governmental actors. And this is something that, of course, involves a dimension of belief about the future of a particular market, and that's super interesting, right? And I think worth exploring. Okay. Another thing that I think is really worth exploring is thinking about how markets actually respond to things like cybercrime. I think this is like a wide open topic area. There's only a handful of papers that have thought about cybercrime, especially leveraging big data to think about the impacts on, for example, stock prices. It was actually a project that I worked on with students in a summer program here at Harris a few years ago, and I still think it's sort of a wide open question. I think the last thing that I will share is that there are a set of important projects to be done about the future of global trade. And if these are at all topics of interest, I could go on and on about all of the amazing data that one could, if they had resources, gain access to think about both who has ownership of reports, as well as the flow of international trade in and out of these really important ports, and how the future of war might not actually be a war fought with guns. It's going to be a war fought with who gets to control butter, who gets to control the flow of trade. And so I'm gonna go ahead and stop there. I know this has been a bit long-winded, but I hope you walk away with the sense that like the toolkit that you would learn in the various programs that we offer would enable you to think about some really important big picture questions, to leverage data to study things at the frontier of human knowledge, but also to shape the policies that will ultimately impact the future of our planet, the prosperity of the people around us, the just policies that will enable the success of others, and the inclusiveness of those policies in the long run. So again, thank you for joining me this evening, and I look forward to answering any and all of the questions that you have to ask.